Welcome back, everyone. Can you hear me? We're pleased to have National Chief Perry Bellegarde join us this afternoon. Perry was elected AFN National Chief on December 10th, 2014. He's from the Little Black Bear First Nation in Treaty 4 territory, and he served as the Chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations and Saskatchewan Regional Chief for the AFN. I'm glad he's double checking all my facts are correct here. He also served as the travel chair of the Touchwood File Hills Capel Tribal Council, counselor for Little Black Bear First Nation, and Chief of Little Black Bear. Oh, that's a repeat, sorry. National Chief, thank you for joining me in discussion on what reconciliation and inclusive economic growth can mean for First Nations and for Canada. It's a very informal discussion. I have a few questions, and we understand you're willing to take some from the audience as well. So thank you again for coming. And everyone, welcome our National Chief.
Hi.
So let's start off with one question. You have often talked about closing the gap. So can you explain what you think the opportunity for First Nations and for Canada when we close the gap?
Oh, it's huge. I don't know if a lot of you know about what gap I'm talking about, but there's a huge socioeconomic gap between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. And I always use the number 6 versus 63rd. And according to the United Nations Human Development Index, quality of life, Canada is rated 6th. I would say up high, 6th. Great country to live. But when you apply the same indices to Indigenous peoples, we're 63rd. So it's like 6 versus 63rd. So this is the gap that exists right now. And this gap that I talk about is everything we always talk about as First Nations chiefs and leaders. This gap represents the high youth suicide rate amongst Indigenous peoples. It's 5 times the national average. This gap represents the overcrowded housing in our communities. This gap represents 132 boil water advisories. This gap represents the 1,200 missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. This gap represents the 40,000 First Nations kids in provincial care. Like, it represents the low graduation rate. It represents the 10,000 students on the post-secondary student wait list. So this gap is huge. So maintaining the status quo is not acceptable for our people, and it is not acceptable for Canada to maintain status quo because there's a high social cost. There's a high economic cost to maintaining the status quo. So closing the gap really becomes a mantra that everybody in Canada should get behind and say, yeah, the status quo is not acceptable. So making investments, I'll say making investments in human capital. The fastest growing segment of Canada's population are young First Nations men and women. So invest in human capital. In Canada, you've got an aging workforce. People are getting older. You've got a young, dynamic, growing labor force. So investing in human capital means you're going to have huge returns on investment into the future. That's one gap, you know. And then in terms of the economic reconciliation, there's billions upon billions of probable economic ventures across Canada. And I'm talking about oil and potash, uranium, the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario. You got LNG, you got pipelines, all these things happening. And there's a huge economic opportunity. But if Indigenous peoples aren't involved in any real meaningful manner, shape, or form, it's not going to happen. So you're going to miss out on an opportunity. And so there's a huge opportunity for economic stability, for environmental protection, to close this gap when you start involving Indigenous people from start to finish on any project. And there's billions, let me tell you, across Canada. And so we need to be involved. So that, to me, is a huge opportunity for growth, a huge opportunity to close this gap. And another statistic I always use is that if Canada would have started investing in closing the gap, so proper housing, proper education, proper water, on young First Nations by over a 25-year period. I think the study was done in 2005, that over a 20-year period, by 2025, if it would have started back then, $400 billion in GDP, economic growth, would be added to Canada's economy. And then $125 billion in social spending would be saved. So you start talking numbers. So I tell the non-Indigenous people in the crowd, if you can't get your head around and start embracing inherent rights, Aboriginal rights and treaty rights, just get your head around the business case. And you're going to get behind some of these things we want to see move forward. That's the opportunity.
So in relation to closing the gap, what do you think the federal government's role is in achieving this?
Well, that's a really good question. I think we have a huge opportunity.
I'm glad I'm on this side of the microphone.
You know, the Crown has a huge opportunity to play. Not only the federal government, but provincial governments as well. Even municipal governments, when you start talking about additions to reserve, have a role to play. And so do First Nations governments. So when you start talking about the federal government, and I think as Indigenous peoples, we do have a great opportunity now to take advantage of the sunny ways that are here in Canada. Because it's all about having access to policymakers and to legislative makers. And we've had this Prime Minister come to our Chiefs in Assembly, and I see some chiefs in the crowd, and this is the first time ever that a sitting Prime Minister has ever addressed the Chiefs of Canada. He didn't do it once, but he did it twice. So every December, because we get together as chiefs twice a year, we have 634 First Nations chiefs across Canada. We have 60 plus Indigenous nations, different tribes, different languages, right? Much diversity. And so the sitting Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, came to our Chiefs Assembly last year, and he came this year. And we've got him committed to come every year. But we also have commitments on a few things. So last year he committed to 5 things. This year he committed to 4 things, 3 things. Last year he committed to the chiefs that there would be an inquiry into missing murders of Indigenous women and girls. He also committed that all 94 Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action will be honored and implemented. He also committed that the 2% funding cap, which we've had in place for 20 years as First Nations chiefs and councils, would be lifted, and that a process would be established to work towards long-term, sustainable, predictable funding, right? And he said there'd be investments in education, and then he said there would be a law and policy review. 5 things were committed last year. This year he comes and commits some new things and some old things. He said there would also be, done in collaboration with Indigenous peoples, there would be a new piece of legislation to protect, to revitalize, regenerate, rejuvenate Indigenous languages. Whoa, our chief stood up. Fantastic. Because we say we're self-determination as Indigenous. We have rights. We're Indigenous peoples. You know, we have the inherent right to self-determination. And language is key to that. So we have our own languages, our own laws, our own lands, our own people, and our own identifiable forms of government. 5 elements. So language is very fundamental to our survival. And we're all speaking this beautiful language called English, right? Mais oui, je parle français un petit peu, mon ami. Bienvenue tout le monde. Oui. Ouais. But language. And the myth we say that this beautiful country called Canada was only founded on 2 founding nations. No. I don't understand that. So language is very key. So working on language revitalization. And even to the non-Indigenous brothers and sisters in the crowd, even when you regenerate or focus on your language, studies have shown that when a young First Nations person is fluent in their language, when they're 11 or 12 years of age, they're more successful in school. They know who they are and where they come from, and therefore more successful in life. Even that's an investment in human capital. So language is very key. There'd be a new piece of legislation. We have to work. We've got to beaver away. Get to work on that. He also said there's going to be legislation for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, done in collaboration. Canada endorsed it. They supported it. You know, without qualification. So how do we fit this major international piece of work into Canada's domestic constitution without creating upheaval? We say it can be done. veto. You don't even want to talk about veto. We can come back to that. But anyway, UN declaration, legislation for that. They also said federal law and policy review. So 3 other major commitments this year in December. And those are huge commitments. So break it down. You had Minister Raybould here. The importance of law, all the laws that have to be changed and updated. What's the process for that? So C-38, C-51, C-45, C-27, C-10, C-6, the list will go on and on and on, that don't respect Section 35 of Canada's Constitution, don't respect inherent rights, don't respect treaty rights, have to be changed. And then the policy one. This is a good one. Because all the policies that govern, that affect our lives as Indigenous peoples, are based on termination of rights, not recognition of rights and titles. So all these policies, like comprehensive claims, got to be fixed. Like specific claims, have to be fixed. Even the word claims, claims. From an Indigenous person's perspective, maybe it should be land restoration would be a better word than claims. And then additions to reserve policy. And then the big one, the inherent right to self-government. That policy that's been in place for 20 plus years. That shapes and guides all the 95 plus tables that they have across Canada. It's based on a termination piece. It's not recognition piece. So lots of work there. Law and policy review. And then the big question, how do we move beyond the Indian Act as Indigenous peoples? What do we mean by nation to nation? I grew up listening to this phrase, that nations make treaties. Treaties do not make nations. So how do we move beyond the Indian Act now that's been in place since 1876? Because that's the animal that we've got to carve down and move beyond and create our own laws, occupy the space, occupy the jurisdiction. And I've said to chiefs, if you don't want federal law to apply, and if you don't want the provincial laws to apply, create your own laws. If you don't want your Child and Family Services Act in Saskatchewan to apply to you, create your own First Nations Child and Family Services Act and occupy the field. So working out the jurisdictional dilemma, the jurisdictional challenge. That's where we're going to have to start taking things. So the role of this government is huge. No question. Huge opportunity. Huge opportunity. And then I'll urge people, policymakers, decision makers, to don't get alarmed that when you see 8.4 billion on Indians. Because I go across Canada and some say, what? Why are they spending so much on Indians? There's a gap. And then I go out to our leadership and they say, why are you, Chief Bellegarde, jumping off the roof saying, great stuff, it's better than Kelowna? We don't see it in the communities. So the next challenge is, how do you take a vision that's big like this, that's been espoused, nation to nation, that the Prime Minister is espousing and Cabinet is espousing and all the ministers are espousing, but then the bureaucracy's vision is like this, and the Deputy Ministers and Privy Council office and Prime Minister's office, it's got to be expanded so it fits, and the deliverology's got to be implemented now. Let's get some results moving here. Challenges. So for us, yes, we need the work of the federal government, no question. And it all comes down to federal budgeting cycles. How are we influencing the federal budget? Get behind the need for continual, long-term sustainable investments in housing and water and infrastructure, all the above, right? That's what I see. I also see opportunities. Because this is public policy. We're talking economic reconciliation, right? We're talking self-determination, self-government. But you have to start talking about economic self-sufficiency. So where does that fit? How do you create economic wealth? And I have a degree in business. I've never been in business. And I've been to many conferences over the last 30 years, all these conferences. And it comes down to a number of things. Lack of access to capital for First Nations businesses. How do you have access to capital? Gaining access to capital, major markets. I see Chief Red Belrose here. He's got a major multi-billion-dollar project on reserve, the only one in Canada for a potash mine. How does he generate $3 billion? What about federal loan guarantees? What about bonds? What about rating? All those things can be looked at so that there's a big access to capital pot somewhere to help sustain developments like that. Access to capital. Then the other one was always bonding. Can't bid on that big multi-million-dollar contract. Bonding is an issue for my business. And then capacity in terms of training. And then all the policies that you have to jump through when you're under the Indian Act. So 4 things you got to fix. It's been like that for 30 years. So there's some thoughts and ideas of the role of the federal government. And I thought, and I did an interview this morning. What was that company or name? What was it? BNN, yeah, that one. And we're talking about economic, this is what we're talking, reconciliation. And I said there's also a role for the provinces and the regulatory agencies. Who issues licenses and permits to these different companies to go and explore? Who issues licenses and permits to go and operate in these provinces and territories? Who does that? Some is the feds, but most of it's from the provinces. So what about a simple policy change, I said? That before any license or permit is issued from any agency, whether it be federal or provincial, before they're issued to this private company that wants to go and develop potash or develop uranium or develop coal or transport across our traditional ancestral lands, forestry, before any permit is issued, that company has to have a strategy and plan for First Nations engagement on procurement, on employment, on revenue benefit sharing. And if that company does not have a plan in place, do not issue them a license or permit. Boom. You'll see some great stuff happening, knocking on the doors of our chiefs and councils, our tribal councils, our economic development corporations for key strategic partnerships. It's a simple policy change. Getting us involved in the economy. That's one way where it doesn't cost any money. So private industry, private sector, have to start putting on their First Nations Aboriginal thinking hat as well, internally. It's part of their business planning model going forward. So there's 1, 2, 3 things. Federally, provincial. You want any more?
You know, you actually asked yourself all the questions on your list. Easiest job ever. Thank you. But I'm considering allowing the audience, we have about 5 minutes left to answer.
Sorry.
To ask me. Don't be sorry. It makes my job easy. I'm all for it. Anyone from the audience have any questions?
Yeah, good afternoon, Grand Chief. Thanks for your comments. Rocky Sinclair, I'm with the Alberta Indian Investment Corporation out of INAC First Nation in Alberta. This is a bit of a contentious question as it relates to pipelines. And I know it's a difficult question, but I think it is relevant because it's a matter of recognizing the diversity of thought when it comes to economic development within our own community. What do you see strategically that either the AFN can do or the community can do to help Alberta, in a sense, get access to tidewater, which in turn will help the First Nations people within Alberta and be able to manage both the concerns of the environment and the economy?
Good question. And what we've always stated is we support the right to self-determination. And that's the right to say yes or the right to say no. And that right rests with the First Nations themselves and the communities. We've always sought balance, seek balance, create the space for dialogue. And as comfortable as that is, because we have chiefs that support pipelines. There's no question chiefs support pipelines. We also have some chiefs that don't support pipelines, right? We have some chiefs that support oil and gas development because they have it in their communities. They want to get their resources to tidewater. Then we also have some chiefs that say, no, 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 leave the oil and gas in the ground in Mother Earth. So we have a huge, diverse opinion amongst chiefs. I'll always respect that. So what we're doing, because I committed this at our last Chiefs Forum in December, we need the space for dialogue. So we have a National Energy Forum coming up, March 22 and March 23. Space for dialogue. Public sector, private sector, federal government, we have the ministers coming, role of the provinces. When you start talking about pipelines, it's really a balancing effect. You're cutting across ancestral lands, you're cutting across treaty territories. The ones that support pipelines, they'll say, well, we want an ownership, we want an equity stake in that pipeline. So think big, right? But as well, there's going to be others that say, how do you balance that with the environment? That's the big question. So we support developments, but not developments at all costs or any costs. There's got to be balance and respect for the land and water. Seeking that balance is going to be always a challenge. Like because I've got chiefs. I think of Chief Wally Fox from Onion Lake. He's got oil and gas developments. He wants to get his resources to Tidewater. What's the most effective and efficient and safest way to do that? By rail, or by pipeline, by truck? It's generated thousands upon thousands of dollars for his First Nation. But how many out of the 634 can say that? How many have that opportunity? Every reserve is at a different level, right? So the only way to answer that is to seek balance and to create a space for dialogue. And then for the chiefs that feel their rights aren't respected, there's always going to be the political and legal challenges, right? I've said it this way, that if we can get involved in the development and the dialogue of any kind of mega project from start to finish, you're going to create economic certainty and use the UN Declaration as a guideline for that. Use the United Nations Declaration. Don't be afraid of that. Don't be afraid of free, prior, and informed consent. Don't be afraid of duty to consult and accommodate. You're going to get Indigenous peoples around the decision-making tables, and you're going to get better decisions for the land and water, but as well as sustainable economic development strategies going forward. Seek the balance all the time.
I think we have time for one more question. Nobody?
Sorry, I don't mean to hog the questions, but this is an opportunity. Jody Brunin from Ottawa. I'm wondering, you're talking about closing the gap. I see that there's a rhetorical advantage to using that talk. I'm just wondering, to what extent does it actually inspire people in communities if you say, like, look, let's get behind this. Don't you want to close the gap? You know, it seems like the kinds of issues that the last speakers are talking about, or even what you mentioned about the Language Act or rebuilding our communities and things like that, that if you focus on that, then the gap closes without focusing on, you know, let's take these measures to close the gap. I just don't know how inspiring that is to communities. A question, I guess.
It's not so much as a question as a statement. So it's a good statement. How do you inspire people that have been demoralized for the last 500 years? How do you inspire colonization, people that have been colonized? How do you inspire people that feel the intergenerational trauma of the residential schools? How do you get that pride back amongst our young First Nations men and women that don't even want to be Indians anymore? How do you get that back? Because it was beaten out of them in schools? The residential schools, I've said this, there are two things in this country called Canada that really hurt Indigenous peoples. Two things, and we still feel the effects of them. One is the residential schools. That's the big one. And we feel the intergenerational trauma so much that our kids don't even want to be First Nations anymore. They want to be black. So much that our kids lost their pride, that they don't want to be Indians. You know, I know people that went to university that denied their heritage because it was safer to be a Mexican than being a First Nations, because society views us in such a negative light. How do you get the hope and inspiration and pride back amongst our people after residential schools? That everything good about being a First Nations person is no good. Your language is no good, your ceremony is no good, your hair is no good, you're no good, and then on top of that, you throw physical abuse and sexual abuse and mental abuse. You're not healthy coming out of that institution. And then now you're expected to raise a family. And now you're expected to have pride into who you are. That's one piece. So getting that pride back. So our young men and women walk in both worlds. They need to go to school. They need to go to university. They need to have techno-vocational skills training on one hand. But equally important are your languages and your ceremonies and your traditions and your customs and who you are, where you come from. Our old people always say you need both walk in balance, get that pride back. You can see that, you know. So you need to move beyond the residential schools. The other one is the Indian Act, 1876, still here in 2017. Colonization oppression, no question. So there's hope and inspiration to our young people when you see First Nations men and women breaking down the stereotype of being dumb, stupid, lazy, drunk on welfare. When you see First Nations people that are becoming doctors and lawyers and business people. First Nations people becoming scientists, becoming RCMP members, becoming members of parliament, people taking our rightful place around decision-making of tables, whether it be public sector or private sector. That, to me, is hope. That, to me, is inspiration. When you can start showcasing that, you know, and then you start showcasing people that are still attending fun dances, still going to sweats, you know, that's pride and hope and inspiration. You're getting it back. And that's why we say on this 150, yeah, 150 years of Canada, but really it's 150 plus. And it's the next 150 years that really should be a waking up for everybody across Canada, and it's the young First Nations, Indigenous men and women that are going to write that story. And to me, it's going to be a real positive one, because I see a lot of that hope and inspiration coming back, and that pride coming back. They're standing up. I'm Cree, and I'm from Little Black Bear, and I'm damn smart, right? And most are going to start saying that. Not going to be ashamed of who they are. That's what I see. That's hope and inspiration.
And on that note, thank you so much for spending time with us today, National Chief.
Thanks for the opportunity. We'll see you again.
So the next panel is about to assemble, so I'll invite Shannon to the stage now to moderate our last panel discussion. And I'll introduce Shannon while that's happening. Shannon is Cree Inuit from Fort Alberni First Nation of the, Mushkegowuk Nation. He has over 15 years of industry and economic development experience, primarily focused on Aboriginal development. My apologies for the pronunciation. He is an entrepreneur, commercial lender, business and community developer, and a management consultant with proficiency in remedial management optimization and business plans. And most recently, he was the executive director of the Ontario First Nations Technical Services Corporation and the manager of Aboriginal Affairs and Sustainability with De Beers Canada. He now serves as CEO of the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. Welcome, and thank you.
Are we doing a panel? Yeah. Oh, excellent. Okay. Oh, I'm going to use this. Excellent, excellent. Okay, thank you. I'm going to wait for everybody to get up here. I just got to say that I'm very humbled to be up here on the stage. Miigwet spiritino, chipakitinogoyan chipechayimian, chipechet awichitabamek koga miswe kayipechegota, ashakenogokiabetisok, kenogokiabetisok chigi niganastamik, pamatason, kite wichen animo kosche, siatebemematasojig miswe, pistabagnochi, maskego. My name is Shannon Matadawabin. I'm from Fort Albany, Ontario, Northern Ontario. It's the Mushkegowuk territory. I grew up in an isolated community of Fort Albany, where I was trained by my grandfather, one of the last trappers of the region, which allows me to speak my language And the National Chief is right that it gives you a lot of confidence in what you do. I've got a big passion for our people in ensuring that economic development and sustainability long-term is implemented. We've heard a lot of ideas today, a lot of input, and a lot of stuff that Don and the board can take forward to the government to try to implement, so that an organization like NACCA can implement some of that stuff, so that we can attack that gap, so that we're moving forward. We're going to get to some questions here, but this is also a panel that's here to educate you. So we want to make sure that you're also getting what you want from this. So if you could just take 2 minutes and introduce yourselves to each other around the table. I don't know if you've had a chance to do this. Share a business card, say hello, and really get to know each other, because right here, this is your opportunity to move forward. We got goalposts right now, and we want to move them forward. And unless you know each other, can share with each other, then we're not going to go anywhere. So please,
Isn't that long?
seriously,
Okay.
introduce yourselves to each other. Share a business card.
Like 5 times or something.
That says a lot about the both of you, right?
We like stages.
Nice to meet you. Oh, man.
I never shook your hand, sorry.
Watch it, watch it.
Great to see you. Good to see you.
Oh, it's great, great, great.
It's about 100 per side. Roughly 100. I think some people have come and gone.
Yeah.
Much fewer than usual. Love to. Enjoy being last sometimes.
Yeah.
And talk to yourself. Sure. But
I find like when the room empties, that's when the funnest.
All right, that's great. Let's all sit down again. We're going to try to learn something from the panelists today. You guys are going to have an opportunity again to speak with each other. Now, I could read about their extensive backgrounds and what they've done for the community, but I much prefer each of them to introduce themselves and provide about 30 seconds of an overview of who they are, what they've done, and just tell about where they're from. Thank you very much. Ian.
Wojtka, Shannon, Chinquamantome, the Algonquin, Okomeo, the Seyaquat, Chinquamantome, Nesa and Halak, Isokyo, Pashamen, Tinachan, Kopmish Oath, Komasquim, Tamil, Hatsis Kopoyen, so it's with Tanoyap and Toquetos. First of all, just thanking the Creator for a beautiful day today. Seeing that snowfall this morning was a blessing, that blanket of purity and snow, setting new tracks as for Canada in this fresh, sacred land of ours. Thanking our elder and the Algonquin family for your hospitality and welcoming our visitors from Australia, and each and every one of you. I want to commend you for your commitment to this very important topic. My ancestral name is Hollick. For those of you that know Vancouver area, Hollick was the son of Hatzlanoch, known as Kitsilano. My chief name is Sukyo, and I come from the Squamish and the Musqueam peoples in what is now Vancouver.
My name is Manny Jules. Is this on? My name is Manny Jules. I'm from Kamloops, a Shuswap, a little Shuswap Indian, and I've dedicated my life to trying to ensure that our people are an integral part of the economy, but also based on jurisdiction and governance.
Hi everyone, Karen Restuel. I introduced myself a little earlier today from Dokeith First Nation, which is a very small community on what is known today as the French River. Prior to contact, it was known as the River with Two Mouths. And for those of you who like to situate yourself on a geographical map, it's somewhere between North Bay and Sudbury. So just give you a sense of where that is. I'm a daughter, a sister, and recently an auntie, and that's probably the biggest role I'm carrying today. Thinking of that next generation. Nothing greater than a reminder than having a young one running around your legs on the day-to-day. My background, worked with the Chiefs of Ontario as the Director of Justice, provided some advice to the Ontario Regional Chief, and because I do have a background in law, made the choice to move over and develop some expertise in the area of administrative law and dispute resolution. So I'm currently a vice chair with Ontario tribunals. Beyond that, you might be confused as to why I'm sitting on an inclusive growth and talking about the economy panel, but as I share more of my story and where I come from, it'll all make sense. Thank you.
Great. I'm Ken Coates. I'm delighted and honored to be here. Feel very warmly welcomed onto Algonquin territory. It's been just a wonderful day. I'm a non-Aboriginal person, but the background is I was raised in the Yukon. Experience of growing up in Whitehorse actually shaped my entire life and all the work that I've done. Used to spend a lot of time in Kamloops, used to live in Squamish, a lot of time in British Columbia and out west and out east as well. My fancy title is I'm a Canada Research Chair in Regional Innovation at the Johnson Sandler Graduate School of Public Policy, which essentially means I'm paid to talk a lot. So I'm trying not to talk too much. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I've spent my whole career working on issues of Aboriginal economic development, and now working on the question of science and technology and how we use sort of the new economy to improve the quality of life in Indigenous and northern communities.
Excellent, thank you. So we've heard a lot today, and we've got 4 panelists up here. We want to get some insight into what you thought of the day. What surprised you? What are some of the concerns that you heard that we need to really think about? Because when we put in the context of helping the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board develop policy to move the goalposts forward, we really have to think and provide honest comments. So, Ian, if you can start.
Sure. Well, thank you. I thought today was a wonderful opportunity to really articulate the complexities of what is known as truth and reconciliation. And I thank the commissioners and all of the elders. You know, I attended a lot of the TRC events over the years and seen for the first time our elders articulate the darkness that they had carried with them for so many decades, and the trauma of our children being taken away. And you know, growing up, I was very fortunate. I was raised by my grandparents and brought up in our language and in our traditions and our culture, in the longhouses and the ceremonies, but also out in the lands and the territories, which is something that growing up I felt was common knowledge. But seeing the experience in our families, very little was talked about around the legislative oppression and the marginalization, alienation of our peoples, and the sinister tactics that colonialism brought not only to Canada, but to Australia, New Zealand, the U.S., many other places that have experienced marginalization of Indigenous people. So we recognize that this isn't just a Canadian issue, this is a story of humanity. And you could throw a dart on the map and recognize that any group has been oppressed fighting over dirt and toys for millennia, and it doesn't make it right. It means that we have an opportunity here to grow and to mature as a society. So being candid in the presentations today was very important to be uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable in order to go through the fire to get to the other side. There's no magic bullet here. There's no silver bullet that's going to slay this dragon, but incremental growth is something we're experiencing that was not afforded to my parents. I'm the first generation out of residential schools. So to see rapid growth in this trajectory that we're on now is very important. The premise that this is a free and vacant land, that narrative is not sustainable. That somehow, you know, this was a found land, and you know, the National Chief spoke of it. You know, the narrative that this country is founded on French and English marginalizes and makes us invisible in our own land. And in fact, it's a loss to Canadians because our history is your history. And to celebrate 150 years is not a celebration to the average First Nations person in this country. It represents oppression. And how do we move beyond blame, shame, and judgment I think there's a wealth of ideas here and a wealth of action. So you create this cohort here. You have your think tanks. You create a vision. You go forward and you articulate that vision. And we're going to get feedback. No matter what, we'll get resistance. But we start showing tangible results, small incremental results. Start demonstrating that this is actually possible, that we can transform. And when we look to the millennia of our history and our stories as First Nations people, there are many chapters of change and transformation, catalysts of change, right back to the ice ages, the great floods, pre-glaciation, where scientists try and define us, that somehow we came over a land bridge. We have our own stories, our own truth, our own laws, our own history, and that's been systemically denied. So it's time to share that as Canadians, and it's time to break this barrier of silence that's been the narrative up until now.
Thank you, Ian. Manny, same question. Surprises and concerns that you heard today.
Well, I think the biggest surprise to me was when Claudette didn't show up. and Don came over and asked me to say the opening prayer. So when that happens, you know you're old.
I told her.
My dad passed away just a couple of years ago, and I would always tease him about being an elder, and he'd always deny it, even into his 70s. I'm 64. Even though my community considers me an elder, I'm not. I've learned lots of things in my life, and thank you, Don, for asking, but I don't do opening prayers. I've had the opportunity to experience lots of different things that haven't been open to a lot of different Aboriginal people. I've traveled extensively all over the country, all over the United States. I've met with tribes, I've met with communities, I've been to Peru, working with Hernando de Soto, been to New Zealand, recently a couple of times over to Australia. And, these are countries that are facing exactly the same things that we are. It's how can Indigenous populations be an integral part of the state government and be an integral part of the economy. And what's happened, because of colonization, we have forgotten about what we call the Columbian Exchange. What's happened, and the gifts that we've given all of the world is just phenomenal. And so when I go to Australia, I'm eating potatoes. I'm eating, gifts that came from the Americas. Tobacco is all over the world. As a matter of fact, when tobacco started to expand, it was because of the Columbian Exchange, right after Columbus went back to Spain. And within 200 years, there wasn't a place on earth that didn't enjoy the gift of tobacco. And now one of the biggest struggles that Indigenous people are going to be facing as we move into the age of legal marijuana is dealing with the gray marketeering, as it's called, with the tobacco trade. So all of these aspects of our life are being governed by somebody else. And what we have to be able to do as Indigenous populations is to be able to create the institutional basis on which we can begin to move forward. And that means taking into account the resources, but based on our jurisdiction. And we heard that loud and clear by the National Chief and the Minister of Justice. I remember in 1990 when Phil Fontaine ran for National Chief and Ovid Murcredy won, and that led to of course, the Charlottetown Accord. After that, but Jody was up on stage and Bill was pointing to her saying one day she's going to be the Prime Minister. So now she's here addressing us as the Minister of Justice, laying out, an incredible, ambitious plan for us to participate. All of that work is necessary, but what has to happen is we as Indigenous people have to come up with the solutions. There's no way that the federal government, provincial governments, or indeed the municipal governments can come up with the solutions. That has to come from us. Who is best to look after the most vulnerable in our communities? Us. No one else. And so when we have inquiries, we have all of these statistics, why do they exist? They exist because we've been forced to live under a social policy approach. What we have to do now is turn our attention to an economic approach. My traditional name is Huhuet. That means the road. When I was born, my two grannies buried my hook or my belly button in an ant pile so that I would always be busy the rest of my life, and I curse that today.
Excellent. Thank you, Manny. Karen, surprises and concerns from the day.
This goes back to the one question I asked Karen this morning, and I apologize if I threw you off. That wasn't my intention at all. I'm both surprised and concerned that there hasn't been much discussion about the role of young Indigenous people in this country. And why I ask that, and when I say young Indigenous people, I don't say youth intentionally, because I'm not specifically talking about the subset, the 14 to 19 demographic. I'm talking about people who are in their 20s and 30s. These are young people who have been raised by parents who lived through colonial legislation and policies, and most of whom survived those. We're talking about people who they were raised by parents who experienced shame when they were growing up, and because of that experience, made a promise to themselves and a promise to that next generation that they would raise them feeling that sense of pride, the sense of pride that they were denied as young people. Beyond that, the young people today were raised by a generation of people who emphasized the importance of educating ourselves in the mainstream system, because they saw that as a tool to battle down the same legislation and policies that tore our families apart and prevented this country from experiencing its true potential. And so right now we're looking at a group of people, we can refer to them as millennials, but I know that scares a lot of people, the term millennial. But we're looking at a group of people who are in their 20s and their 30s, who have a strong sense of who they are, a strong pride in their identity. They know where they're from. They're educated with the mainstream tools, and they're eager, and they're hungry, and they're ready to go. But where are they? Are we hiring them? And if we are, where are we putting them? What roles are we giving them? Are we putting them in the corner in that entry-level policy position and never really listening to what they have to say? Or are we opening the door and letting them into that boardroom? And not trying to reflect or repeat what they're saying, but allowing them to have a voice at those decision-making tables, allowing them to have a voice in policy creation. And this comes from personal experience. I have, my youngest brother is 25 years old. He's a graduate of a commerce program, top of his class. And right now he's sitting in a federal government department in a corner. And he's not being tapped into. And this is a brilliant young man who was raised in exactly the way that I just laid out for you. So this hits close to home, but I know he's not the only one. There are many others out there. So we have to ask ourselves, what role did the people in this room play in tapping into that? Because I'll tell you what, the youth, the young people that I know, they're not going to wait around for you. They're going to take action. And if the action of the voices are not heard, it's going to turn into rage. And I encourage everyone in this room to Google an article by Max Feinday. The title of it is Rage or Reconciliation. And he laid it out very well. If older generations don't offer youth a seat at the table, we will only be making another round in the cycle of anger and protest. And so I know the people in this room, that's not what we want. We don't want to go there again. We've been there. It was painful. We're moving through it, and we're moving to better places. So let's be part of that solution, and let's engage everyone.
Thank you, Karen. And Ken Coates, insights on surprises and concerns.
We've had some great observations already, and I'll just add a couple of them. I think first off, and I shouldn't be impressed in the sense that I'm so used to this. JP and I have been talking about these things for 5 years or so more. I shouldn't be impressed, but I really am. about the optimism. All these comments are really well taken, but in fact, what you actually see are First Nations taking complete control of their lives. They're pushing the boundaries, demanding opportunities, creating space for themselves. And when you hear all the different presentations you've had today, we're not talking about banging on doors anymore. We've already opened the doors and we're sort of kind of locking them behind us. And I think that's a really, really good development. And so I think the scale of optimism, I just wish more non-Indigenous Canadians could actually see this. Go to some of these CAB sort of conferences, regional economic development conferences, see the spirit that's there and the determination is really, really impressive. Another part that sort of comes back to the role of government that I find really fascinating, there's been a change in conversation, and a couple of people talked about this already. What I actually see is that we're moving into an age that I describe as the co-production of policy. And it sounds really subtle. It doesn't sound like it isn't a policy by itself. What you're actually getting, both of you were talking about this, you can't create a policy for First Nations people without First Nations being at the table and setting the priorities. I think we're about 2 years away from a situation where the federal budget for Aboriginal people and Indigenous affairs is actually set at a table with First Nations organizations and associations and representatives, where no policy comes before government that is not co-produced with the Indigenous communities, however you define that. That is actually the revolution we need next. This idea that Ottawa will sort of go away, close the doors, do some policy thinking, and then pop out with a policy and we can all react to it, I don't think that's going to happen. And I think we're actually going to see way better policy, way more effective strategies sort of going forward. Third item that I would say, and it came up in a whole bunch of these different conversations, I was raised in Whitehorse. In 1973, they started the Yukon land claims process. When that happened, the non-Aboriginal people in the Yukon went ballistic. Almost all of them. They just thought this was the stupidest idea. We've been paying for all your schooling and your lovely houses and all your reserves, and how could you possibly want more than what we've already given you? And First Nations just stared back and said, what are you talking about? You've actually put us on the reserves, you've controlled our lives in that sort of way. So this is the historian in me. Look what's happened since the early 1970s. Look at the scale of the wealth we're talking about. We're talking about $3 billion investments on an on-reserve potash mine. I like to tell a couple of examples that I use. Chief Jim Boucher was giving a conference in Fort McKay First Nation, in Fort McMurray. And he said, got a big room full of 400 people from the oil and gas sector. And he said, I want these people to stand up. And he sort of named about 14 people. And one by one they stood up. And he said, these are our local millionaires. You remember that? These are our local millionaires. And you could see the whole bunch of people from Vancouver and Calgary were up there sort of, coming up to sort of be part of this process. And they're looking around going, there's all these millionaires. We haven't got our head around the idea, pardon the phrase, of a rich Indian. And this is one of the best things that can possibly happen. When you have First Nations people who are being successful, who are running multi-million-dollar companies, who are leading economic development in their communities and the province as a whole, this is absolutely, absolutely fantastic. I think within 10 to 15 years, 2 to 4 of the top 100 companies in Canada will be owned and controlled by Indigenous people. Look at the scale of the Aboriginal Economic Development Corporation. You, sir, are probably going to be one of the bosses of them. When I watch what's actually going on in the city of Vancouver, multi-billion-dollar investments, buying up land, developing in that kind of an atmosphere, this is one of the greatest things that can happen. And people have no idea this is coming. Folks in Toronto, Montreal don't really understand that. Go up north. Go to Whitehorse. Get somebody to lead you around town and talk about how many hotels are owned by Indigenous people, how many stores are owned by the construction companies owned by Indigenous people, and the communities have gotten over it. They've actually embraced Indigenous empowerment as being one of the best things that's happening in the territory.
Thank you. So now this is where we have some fun. We have the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board. They provide advice to the government on issues related to Indigenous economic development. Now we're going to ask the panel right now to give their thoughts on what are bold, concrete, and honest ideas that the government needs to hear right now on how we can move the goalposts forward. This is actually policy that we need to tackle. Now I'll allow them to choose the area that they want to focus on, but this is actually moving the goalposts forward, things that we might have been talking about for a long time. 2% of the federal budget dedicated to Indigenous goes to economic development. 2%. It was the same thing 30 years ago when I was doing business development work. It's still discretionary, which means it can happen or it can't. Non-discretionary funds is the direction that I know that the National Board is seeking with their strategic plan. So maybe I'll start with Manny. Bold, concrete, honest ideas that the government needs to hear right now, National Board.
I'm, it's been talked about what are we going to do about the young people. I'm kind of at the end of, the gifts that I'm going to be leaving all of you in the very near future. I want to be able to retire to New Zealand and carve Ponamu, greenstone. But in the meantime, these are some thoughts. One is we've got to create a number of institutions. One of them in particular has to be an institution that helps First Nations develop infrastructure. Now, a lot of our communities like Squamish and Kamloops and others can manage this on their own, but a lot of communities can't. And when you look at what's happening in Ontario, they've got an infrastructure model that goes out and helps not municipalities and counties and whatnot. We have nothing like that. And so we're expected to spend money after 10 years of negotiation with the Department of Indian Affairs and have that capital project built within 1 year. That can't happen. What we have to do is create an institution that helps develop standards and train people, young people, because they're the ones who are going to be having to run the operations, to have business-ready infrastructure within our communities. And coupled with that, we have to look at what kind of a resource base are we going to require to operate them, because this can't be a dependent model. And so one of the other aspects I've been working on is what I call an Aboriginal resource tax. That means that First Nations should be able to have tax jurisdiction within our traditional territories, within our treaty territories, and within our marine jurisdictional areas, so that we can clearly benefit from all resource development that happens on our lands. We still say it's our lands. We have to be able to develop tax structures that require the federal and provincial governments, in essence, to get out of the way, so that we can occupy those areas of jurisdiction and we can begin to provide the level of service that's required within our communities. And there are two fundamental things that I've learned in over 40 years of doing this work. And it started to happen to me when we closed the Department of Indian Affairs in Kamloops. Right away when we closed the Department of Indian Affairs, we had occupied it. It was, well, what's going to happen to Indian reserves? What's going to happen to all of the programs, education, housing, and all of those things? By the end of it, it was the summer of 1975. It was the summer of the government rejection of government funds. And so by the end of the summer, we found we didn't build any houses. So we're dependent on the government to build our houses. We couldn't send our kids to school because we had to get funds from the federal government to educate our own kids after the residential school experience. All of those level of services were completely dependent on somebody else. So we have to be able to create an economy that looks after ourselves and indeed is integrated within the overall Canadian economy. And that means dealing with what I call the indefeasible crown. That's both the federal and provincial governments. So when we deal with the federal government, that has to be dealt with through 9124. And that gives life to Section 35. You heard Jody talk about all of this is going to be based on Section 35. But you can't just deal with Section 35 without dealing with the constitutional powers that exist right now. And until there's a new constitutional change, that's our reality. And you're not going to change that probably at least within our lifetimes. So you're going to have to deal with 9124. The federal government is indeed going to have to legislate themselves out of business. We're going to have to get the provincial governments to deal with us on child welfare, on education, and land and resources. So they're going to have to give up tax room because of fiscal relationship. We've got an incredible opportunity when we talk about, in this government, who I call Trudeau the Younger, has committed himself to a new fiscal relationship. To me, a fiscal relationship isn't contingent on programs, but that's what I've been hearing. Let's bundle up all of the programs that you're getting right now and repackage it as a new fiscal relationship. That isn't going to work. What will happen is that in another decade, we're going to be saying, well, that wasn't enough. We need not 5 billion, not 10 billion, but 20 billion. And that will carry on and on and on. And I don't want to create a situation where our governments are managing poverty. And that's the incentive that could happen as a result of a new program-based fiscal relationship. Our governments have to be able to manage wealth. They have to be able to set up standards to facilitate economic development and growth. We have to be able to own our own lands. Right now, all of our lands are owned by the federal government, in theory. So when you look across the country, and I've done an analysis because I had to, British Columbia transferred Indian reserves to the federal government. Most of the other provinces have the title to Indian reserves, and that's registered provincially. So one of the other little gems I want to pursue is our own land title system. You know, why shouldn't Kim's community be able to register their lands in our own land registry so that we can begin to deal with the housing strategies on our own? Right now, in order to build a house, you have to have the minister co-sign for you. And individual housing ownership is one of the fundamental building blocks to building a sustainable economy. Without that, you can't be bonded. You can't get into business unless you're subsidized by another business, you know, saying, I want to encourage this. So those are just a couple of thoughts.
Excellent, Manny. Thank you very much. Karen, some ideas on some bold ideas.
I'm going to preface this by saying that I was raised to believe that anything is possible. If there's a will, there's a way. But I was also shaped by 1980s cartoons, and they're really wacky. If you look back at how wacky and imaginative they are, it kind of will help to understand what I'm about to propose, because it's wacky. I'm a fan of toppling processes, removing the power imbalance from government processes. So government loves to legislate us, right? So what if we flipped it and started legislating everyone else to create a minimum standard of participation? So what I mean by that specifically is, what if there was a legislation that would require every corporation or business entity of a certain size to hire a certain number of Indigenous graduates? And it would be monitored. And if they don't comply, we have someone going in there to manage it for them and ensure their compliance. And beyond that, to support that program or legislation or policy, whatever it would look like, what if we required every academic institution in this country to have a placeholder? And I know universities have, you know, quotas, and they have special admission programs for Indigenous students, but how those are accessed in certain institutions is questionable. What if we had a placeholder for every commerce program across this country, that you had to let in a certain amount of Indigenous students, and that somebody was following up to ensure that that was actually happening? Because yes, those policies do exist, but are they really being utilized? So that's what I would propose. That's one of my crazy ideas.
Ken.
Great ideas all along already. Several things. Create economic space for First Nations. Governments have the capacity. We did it with casinos. We've actually seen a huge amount of opportunity develop by creating that space that First Nations could move into. Good example in Saskatchewan Meadow Lake, where the government sort of allocated a tree farm license to a First Nation, has converted this into an integrated, not just a logging operation, not just a trucking operation and a forestry operation. Now it's become an electric and heat utility. That's a wonderful example of taking an opening and say, we owe it to First Nations to create more of those things. There's thousands of these opportunities across Canada. Governments need to do that in a whole bunch of concerted sort of ways. I think we shouldn't wait for government. If you want to wait for government, we've done 150 years. Sorry, folks. Government will follow a whole bunch of laws and legislation and what have you. The relationship, I describe the resource economy as being the front lines of reconciliation in this country. You want to see where people are actually really working together closely, overcoming barriers, dealing as employees, dealing as managers, joint ventures, all these company kinds of things. Actually, government sort of doesn't show up very much. They might get involved with some training programs and a few sort of loans here and there, but actually it's the relationship with the companies. And it's really important for First Nations to find those good corporate partners. I've done an awful lot of research on the resource sector. I'm a huge fan of the major things that the mining sector, for example, has done. Is it perfect? Not at all. Have we got some world-leading examples? Absolutely. We've got a Mining Association of Canada that goes out of its way to sort of promote in a very public way, their support for resource revenue sharing. In my world, would that have been possible 25 years ago, that the mining sector be promoting resource revenue sharing? Not really. But we've got those good partnerships, celebrate those kinds of things, and actually you're going to discover that government's going to fade further and further and further in the background. And the more that Indigenous people own, the more they operate, the more they control, the more capital they have, government's going to be less important, I think, as time goes along. We've got to do something about bureaucracy. This is not a comment on Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada. I'm about government generally. Too many layers, too many complexities, and it costs a huge amount of money. One part of this, the legal process. I don't blame First Nations going to the courts because they get frustrated by all the things they have to do. But someday somebody will add up the cost of First Nations of spending not one generation, but 2 complete generations fighting for their rights. It's about time we get past that. Minister Wilson-Raybould made some great comments about saying, let's just not stop doing that anymore. We're going to have recognition. Let's go forward in a different sort of way. Final thing I would say, let's start planning for the economy of 2030. And this is a place where I think government really has an important role to play, and where the Economic Development Board has a really important role to play. The world is going to change really fast. If you look at the impact of drones and autonomous trucking by themselves on Indigenous employment in the resource sector, the potential for enormous job losses across Canada is very real. So how are we going to prepare First Nations for a technology-driven, artificial intelligence-based, internet-empowered sort of economy? If we don't start planning for 2030 now, 2030 is going to hit us in the face with a baseball bat. And Indigenous communities are miles behind. The vast majority of our Indigenous communities don't have proper internet service. They aren't getting the training and capacity building in high technology. I think we better start thinking about 2030 and 2040 right now.
I know everybody's going to get a chance to ask questions in a second. I'm going to ask Ian for bold, concrete, and honest ideas for the government.
I think it's important to remove the boogeyman from the bushes, that engaging First Nations doesn't always have to be adversarial and the path of most resistance that lead us to court. You see many successes by engaging right from the onset and creating proper process and frameworks that involve First Nations. In the absence of proper frameworks and process, it maintains the status quo that'll lead us to court and allow the courts to redefine our relationships. We will continue that path, absolutely, if that's the only means possible. Prior to the 60s, we had no legal recourse. So times have changed, and First Nations have exercised their rights, and certainly the Squamish have, along with many other First Nations, to challenge the Crown and challenge the Crown's legitimacy to their claims to our territories outside of treaty, unceded territories. So this dynamic of removing the boogeyman from the bushes to maintain competitive, to allow Canada to be competitive on a global market, being inclusive will yield greater results by creating greater certainty, leading to consent and benefits that flow to First Nations rather than a narrative of abject poverty. So also collaboration amongst First Nations has been the key to success that certainly Andrew touched on in the previous panel, where we moved away from competition over scarcity resources to collaboration. And the way in which we approached that was reaffirming our kinship ties. First and foremost, not the status card that defines who we are and which nation we belong to. Throwing the status cards out the door and coming back as family kinship ties was important to strengthen our values, that when we engage in business, it's not to replicate Western management practices, it's to see a reflection of ourselves in our businesses, that it adheres to our values, our principles, and that's something that Western management has completely removed spirituality from their vocabulary when it comes to relationship to the natural world, all in the name of profit, efficiency, and jobs and growth. And that is fine to a degree, but bringing in First Nations will add value to that process and add greater certainty around sustainability that will meet the social, the environmental, the political, the economic context of this country to allow us to truly move forward. So I think there's still a misconception and there's still a complacency amongst the average Canadian who say, well, there's a First Nations that lives somewhere in the vicinity of my city or my municipality, but they don't recognize whose territory they're on, that no matter where you are in Canada, you're in someone's territory, and there's thousands of years of history that has been, by design, deliberately marginalized. So I think that as we move forward, bringing forward that First Nations aren't just 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever % of the population, and we have to look after them as a minority group, but embracing the whole fabric of Canada is Indigenous, that the foundation of this country is built off of thousands of years of rich history and culture and stewardship and laws that can be incorporated. So restructuring is very important. We can't just maintain the status quo, otherwise why are we here today if we're not willing to get involved and change parts within the engine and remove some of the barriers by utilizing ingenuity. So I think we bring a lot of that innovation, ways of thinking of transformation. That tradition isn't something 200 years ago. Tradition is today. What we do today will someday be traditional. So it's that continuity of tradition on what we are trying to achieve, that vision for our collective future.
One of the things, before we go to the questions, there's an idea brought forward about a Canadian Aboriginal economic strategy. Now, the government has hundreds of programs on various levels at the federal and provincial levels that focus on economic development, and it seems like there's some sort of recreation of the wheel. So there's some merit to having an alignment. So maybe I want to start with Ken Coates on providing some advice to government, to National Economic Development Board, on how we might go about aligning that.
Number one thing I would say is don't use it as a reason to delay things. And so if you actually create a new process and so things get delayed as you go along, frustration is going to grow. I mean, a lot of the times we have inquiries. Royal Commission on Aboriginal People spent a huge amount of time and money, produced a really good report that didn't actually change policy anywhere near as rapidly as we thought. I think what happens is that something like that, an economic strategy, could be a really, really good way of actually making it clear what Aboriginal people aspire to do. I think not very many people know about it. And not very many people know about the achievement. They don't know about the scale of operations. They don't know about the kinds of things that are at issue. I think a lot of people still have a poverty mindset. And the issue is, how do you get somebody to get a trade certificate so they can work in the local bus depot or something like that? They're not realizing the scale of what is actually underway and the kind of issues that are at stake. So I don't think very many Canadians pick up on the question of access to capital, for example, control of the land, those kinds of things. So there's merit in doing that, but I'm a real fan of doing those things quickly. Don't let it drag out for a long period of time. You've got tons of expertise in this room. Can multiply this many times across the country as a whole. 2 or 3 sort of good, effective, well-driven meetings that can come back and talk about this could capitalize on that resource and essentially make a collective statement. And let's say what I said before: bring your business partners with you. They're going to be part of this sort of process, and many of them are very, very supportive of where we see this going.
Excellent. Another one of the concerns that was raised is we're preparing for massive growth in our community, but our communities suffer from a colonized mindset of the policies of government that have been put on them. And I just wanted to ask Ian, what have you done in your community to sort of decolonize the mind, to get prepared for the future and really take hold of that economic opportunity?
Well, certainly I can't take credit for the fruition that we're seeing. It's been built off of generations of effort. Going back to 1791 was first contact for us, where we discovered the first ships in our waters with the Spaniards, Narvaez, and then Captain Vancouver. And then you look at, through the 1800s, the dynamics of this country with the first forts, Fort Langley in 1827, mass depopulation through epidemics, leading to Confederation in the 1870s paired with the Indian Act. We've never sat back and said, please come and take our lands, it's free. We always tried to build a relationship. 1906, our chief sent a delegation to England to implore the crown, to seek honor in the crown. Unfortunately, it didn't yield much results. 1923, we amalgamated. Our 16 hereditary chiefs came together to form a nation, the Squamish Nation. And if you look at post-1960s, how we've continued to challenge the Crown with conspiracy of legislation, land use and occupancy. Building tools has been very important for us to then advance to land use planning, where we look at the macro 30,000 foot over access management, resource management within our territories, rights and title, consultation accommodation built off of many successive court cases, now moving into marine use planning, and our own independent environmental assessments that are legally binding for proponents. That's been important for us to move away from being treated as stakeholders within our own lands, where Canada acts as though they have veto, and they say, well, First Nations, you don't have veto, but we do. It's up to us to determine whether this is national interest. We've heard that many times before. It's just guides today as national interest, basically in the interest of settlers or Canadians not looking at First Nations jurisdiction, our right to make decisions within our territories, or creating proper frameworks and processes. So we've continued to advocate for frameworks, and in doing so, onus falls back on us to restructure our own governance, to move away from the Indian Act chiefs and councils, to be a functioning government that has roles, clear and concise roles and responsibilities that then lead to our limited partnerships, all of our businesses, and how those structures will be efficient and produce results. Those structures create safety, and they build trust. So it doesn't matter who the councils are of the day, the structure will be in place, and it'll allow the nations to flourish. And I think that restructuring is imperative at this time. That's something that we're advocating for within our nation. Certainly with our neighboring First Nations, we built protocol agreements amongst each other, narrowed the scope simply to dispositions of lands that are claimed by the Crown within our shared territories, not trying to solve every issue at once, at one sitting amongst ourselves, but creating a protocol agreement that will look at acquisitions of land or accommodations from lands that are being sold by the Crown. That was an important step forward to help realize and build the framework around restructuring.
Excellent. I'm just looking at the time here. We've got about 17 minutes. I want to leave some time for questions, and maybe we can direct the question to Manny and to Karen. They're next in line. Can we just go out to the, otherwise I'll ask more. Anybody have any questions for our panelists? Got one at the back here.
Hi there. My name is Shannon Burnett, and I work at Natural Resources Canada. In the last 15 months, there's been what I've noticed a greater concerted effort in the public service to reach out to First Nations and to engage them and to consult. And there's been talk of engagement fatigue or consultation fatigue and concerns about that in the government. And I'm wondering if you have recommendations to public servants who are really trying to go out and connect with communities and ways that we can improve our engagement or our consultation, with communities and business leaders.
Karen?
Thanks for the question. That's actually part of one of the messages that I wanted to leave here today. I've worked with the public service, but also worked with a First Nations political organization, so I've been on both sides of those conversations, and I'll be very frank, public servants need to exercise more humility. There are a lot of people in the public service that think they know the answers. They say, I've been working with First Nations for my entire career, I know everybody, I know how it works, I know all the issues, I'm good to go. And if you're that person thinking that right now, then you're probably the person I'm talking to. That you need to check that and make yourself vulnerable and actually say out loud, I don't know. And the person who's going to have the answers is that community that you're engaging with. Now, from the community perspective, one of the reasons, and I'm one voice, right? I can't speak to everyone. But one of the reasons why there's fatigue is because of that attitude that public servants are coming to us with. It's the we know. And we're not engaging in a real conversation. We're not focusing on an actual exchange. And further to that, it's usually a conversation that's held within a really tight timeline. And from at least my community and most communities of folks that I know, real relationships are something that develop over time. And like Ken mentioned, there are industry leaders right now who are showing and proving that that is in fact very true. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
This is a question for Chief Campbell, Marie Delorme. I'm just curious, this collective future that you envision and described, what is the role of entrepreneurship in this? You know, we don't often talk about that, and I know at the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board, we have not had in-depth discussions about entrepreneurialism. But when you look at the Canadian stats, not First Nation stats, but Canadians, small and medium-sized businesses contribute about 30% of our GDP. I would think if we looked at what can we do for First Nations entrepreneurs, I think we might come up with some interesting statistics. And we have AFIs here, right, who are working very closely with entrepreneurs. And here's the thing, those 40,000 businesses that JP talked about, it's easy to start a business. It's really difficult to grow and sustain a business. So would really appreciate some of your guidance and words of wisdom perhaps on what we might take away as we have that discussion.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. And when we look at our ability to articulate our vision, it's very challenging for us in the absence of a functioning communications department, where the role of chiefs and council feel they have to do everything as councillors. We need to, I come back to structure, really trying to look at the different models of success, and I think it was touched on a couple times today, around having your master LPs, having your CEOs, having all of the relationship where the chiefs and councils continue to direct by allowing strategic directives, principles, performance, terms of reference, and then allowing those entities to then function. And within the limited partnerships, you then create joint ventures where you're minimizing risk. You're then creating space for entrepreneurs to flourish with the multitude of services that are required, whether it's natural resources, whether it's the value chain of our forestry companies, or potential new entrants in the market with LNG, or the land developments that we're involved in. We see scalability and the opportunities for young people to step into those spaces. What we're finding is that right back to the hurt and the healing that needs to take place within our families is a priority in order to empower those young people or those families to then take the first step. Because a lot of people say, well, I want to be involved in that, but how? What do I need to do? What is the first step? So we've created mentorship programs through our businesses offices to help guide people to access funding, start building their companies, or partnering them with other companies where we provide opportunities. They bring the expertise, the capital, which builds the experience for young people to then to get involved and see themselves getting involved in the careers, whether it's in finance, legal, entrepreneurialism, business, whatever it may be. There's a number of opportunities from our land portfolio, both on and off reserve, as we build out, for people to be involved. And if they don't do it, my worry is we're just going to outsource it and someone else will do it, where our members will be passive beneficiaries, and they'll just say, allow the nations to become affluent, where the monies then trickle down through programs and services or per capita distribution. And that's not a bad thing, worst case scenario, but it's not where we see ourselves. So I'm thinking the first couple iterations of development and phasing, we need to start instilling that there's real opportunity here for people to step up and engage, and then that will hopefully influence and build more cohorts and more vision and influencers within the communities to then fully engage and scale up into those operations, where we start phasing a number of developments and people are starting to become successful in entrepreneurship. So that's a real priority, is to eventually get to that place. I think we're starting from ground zero. There's about a dozen or a couple dozen members in my nation that are high functioning, very smart, very keen to get involved in that. And I think those champions will influence a number of other people. So success will breed success, and we need to invest in those ones that are really banging on the door saying, I want to get involved in those operations.
Got a question in the back.
Yes, hello again.
Pierre Graffin with the Mining Association of Canada. Just following up on the topic of consultation fatigue. First, just a comment. I think that my own observation, governments don't undertake nearly the kind of training in consultation and engagement with Indigenous communities that our members now do, generally speaking, for their own staff that are working with their local Indigenous partners. In fact, often it's the Indigenous people themselves that have been hired by the company to undertake that kind of, they're often called community liaison officers and so on. So that's a fairly common practice now. But going to the issue of consultation fatigue, we're seeing a trend. There's always been sort of a challenge for our sector, which finds itself subject to federal and provincial environmental assessments. And now, Manny Jules, as you know, in your own community, there's a separate Indigenous environmental assessment being undertaken on top of the federal and provincial for one of the mines in Kamloops, mining projects in Kamloops. There's an example of a potential project on the border of Labrador and Quebec, where it might face 4 separate environmental assessments: Newfoundland and Labrador, Quebec, federal government, and Inuit. So when industry looks at this, they sort of go, oh, wow, this is a little overwhelming. Why can't, and especially industry that's not from Canada, will look at this and go, why can't this country get its act together and have a coordinated process? And what we also hear at the community level is it's the same fatigue. How many governments come to them, including their own, asking similar questions? So just thoughts from the panel on the way forward here, because I think if there is going to be a potential barrier to investment coming in, it's going to be that kind of regulatory environment that we're facing. Don't get me wrong, environmental assessments are absolutely critical for any major project, but do we really need to have 3 or 4 parallel environmental assessments? Couldn't we get our governments to find a way forward where they're coordinated together?
What the gentleman's referring to is Ajax Mines, which is just right within the city boundaries of Kamloops. My community, Kamloops and Skeetcheston, conducted their own environmental review over the potential development. And one of the recommendations I believe that's critically important is the National Energy Board process that's being reviewed right now. What I feel should ultimately happen is that we can have our own environmental processes because we have to believe in our own institutions to be able to do that. And it would fit into the overall process that maybe the federal or provincial governments would have. One of the other things, and just following up with what Ken Coates was saying, it's nice to have resource revenue sharing, but what that means is you can't take that to the bank. So if you have a resource revenue sharing situation, because of the market fluctuations, there's no certainty when you deal with that, and you deal with the Royal Bank or the Bank of Montreal or whatever. And the other part of that is that it moves the liability, as this gentleman knows, to the mining corporation or to the forestry corporation, as opposed to the federal or provincial governments who've got all of the money, all of the jurisdiction right now. And so ultimately, as we begin to move down this path, we shouldn't be afraid of having our own processes to feed into other federal or provincial processes, because without that, you're never going to get the trust. And look at what's happening in South Dakota right now. The reason that that's happening is because the Sioux don't have jurisdiction within what they consider their own treaty lands. And so without an accommodation from this purported jurisdiction from the federal and provincial governments, you're going to have this situation arise over and over again. And as we all know, one of the fundamental basis of the Canadian government is resource development. And then it goes to one of the other questions earlier on about, well, I want to get my product to the market. It's, in this particular case, it's oil. That is happening also in the United States. You've got the Crow tribe in Montana wanting to get their product to the tidewaters, as people have been saying. Who protested it and shut it down but us? You know, the people on the coast said, we don't want that. And why are they saying that? It's because they don't get anything from it. Why is there resistance to linear projects, pipelines and the like? It's because the majority of people don't benefit from that. And so when the National Energy Board is standing up having a review, they're limited by the legislative mandate that they've got. They say, well, we can't deal with that. That's the federal government or provincial government. And the way to fix that is to make sure that our institutions go in line with that we can ultimately get something. So when you're having a linear project or a mine, and you analyze who benefits from that, it's the federal government through income taxes, sales taxes, provincial government through income taxes, sales taxes, municipalities and regional districts and counties through property taxes. What do First Nations get out of that? Nothing. When you go up to Fort Nelson and you look at a $25 million facility that's based in the largest municipality in British Columbia, and then you go to the government office, it's a trailer. That isn't right in this country. And the reason for that is because we don't share in all of the resources. So when there are concerns on the prairies about getting the product to the market, one of the best pieces of advice, support an Aboriginal resource tax so that individuals all along the linear project would benefit from that exploitation of a resource, provided it meets environmental standards that we have to be involved in.
So support that. So we got 2 minutes left. What I want to leave is on a positive note. Now I'm just going to go and ask for a minute each. Just leave the audience with, what do you see the trends to be? What do you see as what do you predict the future to be for our community and economic development? Just a minute each. Ken.
I think we're going to see a massive expansion of Aboriginal business. I think we're going to see a huge growth in the role of Aboriginal people within the sort of commercial sector. We have a problem, and the problem actually is we're leaving Aboriginal men behind. Aboriginal women are doing extremely well, but the Aboriginal men are really suffering. It's actually going to happen to non-Aboriginal men as well. So we're going to see that. I think we're going to see this great expansion. We're going to see more Aboriginal control and influence on a whole bunch of things. You know, whether it's legislated or whether it's logical, we're going to see those engagements. But I would leave you with this thought. I think the challenge going forward is that most First Nations are going to have to start looking at how they manage prosperity. They've been managing despair for a very long time. You're now going to have people with millions of dollars a year of revenue coming into their communities through successful owned businesses, and how you actually manage prosperity while at the same time that you're managing poverty. These things go, that in First Nations community, you're not going to get rid of one automatically. We're looking at a 2-3 generation sort of transition, and I think that's a really formidable challenge that the First Nations will face.
Thank you. Karen.
I see corporations moving forward in a very proactive and respectful way with Indigenous communities. We're going to see what true partnership looks like. And maybe government is a little timid on developing policy that supports that, but I think over time, with corporate Canada kind of plowing the way on that, government will soon fall in step.
Because of what's happening globally, with all the markets, with all of the rejection of the free trade agreements, what's going to happen over the next decade is a further agreement between the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to begin to work closely together through all of the other processes. And that's going to give First Nations not only a market here domestically, but an international market. And that's what we've got to be able to look forward to.
Excellent. Excellent. Ian.
Well, I see an increase in shared governance and shared decision-making, where we will continue to build tools such as the previous question around not being treated as stakeholders in our own territories, but true jurisdiction and decision-making that will lead to economic opportunities that the government can't just issue rights to third-party interests atop of our Aboriginal rights and title without our consent. That will continue to be adversarial. So until we move into a better governance structure that will lead to economic opportunities that involve First Nations and our entrepreneurs, our young people, giving them hope, giving them aspirations, that is paired with environmental stewardship around how, I guess, these projects will be developed within our territories. What we've experienced is a gold rush mentality right from the onset of take as much as you can, maximize profit. The environment is secondary. Indigenous peoples are not even in that equation. That will only lead to more court cases. And that could be the path. That's one tier that we could look at. Chilcotin, the Chilcotin and their title case was very important to wake Canada up around jurisdiction and around then creating the framework of how do we share governance, how does that lead to economics, and how do we respect environmental stewardship that incorporates Aboriginal Indigenous laws and spiritual and cultural context paired with Western science. So I think that that's the path that I'd prefer, is a framework that looks at those three pillars of strength for this country.
Excellent, excellent. Now, not to leave you out, I want to give you an opportunity to share. We have two ways that you can share your thoughts and your ideas so that we can get it to the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board. We got a Facebook page for the Public Policy Forum, or NACCA has put a survey on our website, so you go to our NACCA.ca and you can input and then submit, and it's a little bit more private, and what we'll do is we'll consolidate that and share that information so we can report out on it. We want to keep on building on this because this is the first forum of 3. So this is just the beginning, and this has been a really humbling experience, seeing all the people that are so interested in moving the goalposts forward. And I'm just so happy to be on the same stage with these guys. They provided a lot to this, so thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, eh? Thanks for coming here. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Wow, what an amazing day. I just have a few closing comments before Dawn gets the final last word. How about one more round of applause for what I viewed as a fantastic day? It's been a privilege to be your MC. I really think we have a huge challenge ahead of us after reflecting on all the information we heard today. But I also think that there's enough creativity and talent within Canada to look to ways to close the gap and to find our way forward towards true reconciliation. In my community, in my own path, I helped get rid of the Indian Act in my community. And so my youngest daughter was the first Tsawwassen child born free of the Indian Act. And so there are ways, we have examples now moving forward, and the optimism in this room is inspiring, even if we are wary and suspicious and not entirely trusting. We have very good reasons for all those things. But again, I do take great hope in everything I've heard today and everyone's input. I'd like to thank the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board and NACCA for helping make today possible, as well as the Public Policy Forum. One last comment. I think Chief Ian Campbell maybe gave JP a run for his money on the socks. We should do a poll on that, I think. And there will be other events. Métis one in June in Winnipeg, one focused on Inuit and Nunavut in September. And, I think the Public Policy Forum is open to feedback and trying to help facilitate some space in this discussion around collaboration and engagement. At least they better be, that's why I'm on the board. Anyways, it's been a pleasure, and welcome Dawn for the final word. this is the kind of thing that really excites me, this discussion that we had. I really, really enjoyed this day. I have to let you know, personally I did. And I could tell you that there could have been probably 30 more panels just involving the people in the room here, because we have so many experts in the field of Indigenous economic and business development sitting in this room here. And I like to acknowledge my fellow AFI people here in the room, and really want to give a shout out to you for the work that you do in helping business development in Canada. 40,000 businesses and over, I think, 2.4 billion in loans that we've done collectively. That's a success story that not too many people know about. So I want to thank the AFI group and NACCA especially for the work that you've done in helping us pull this together today. You know, it's very difficult to summarize what's been said today and to talk about all of the good comments and the teachings that we received. One of the things that I was taught is that when you receive a teaching, that you're supposed to share it and express that teaching to as many people as you can. So there were a lot of teachings that were given to us today. I think of some of the ones that stand out in my mind are things like occupy the field. And in that, when I think about that, I think about a small First Nation community on Manitoulin Island that is it's somewhat isolated, and what they're doing is they're developing their own laws, environmental laws pertaining to aquaculture development. So they've been working really hard on that. They developed their whole governance structure first, their constitution, and now they're developing the laws derived from that government. And I think this is great. They're occupying the field and building that. And the thing is, they're willing to share whatever they've done with any other community too. And that's what we need to do, is about the sharing. Another comment that stood out in my mind was that the government needs to establish a First Nation economic relationship, not just a legal relationship. I think, you know, when you think about that, that really says a lot. It means a lot. And I don't think we've done that yet. I think it's been that legal relationship, and sometimes we talk about fiduciary responsibility, but really, you know, that doesn't mean a lot to many First Nation leaders across the country or First Nation people across the country, because it really, our rights aren't protected. We're the only ones who can assert and protect our own rights. So I think we need to really think about that terminology, but also think about this economic relationship. The other thing that resonated with me was this national Aboriginal or Indigenous economic strategy. Really, there isn't one. I always look at the national economic strategies or the provincial ones, and there's, you know, sometimes there's mention about Indigenous people, very in a small part of it, but it's not really something that we look at in a very serious way. I think we really, really need to do that. And one of my fellow board members, Ruth, who just stepped out, but she was talking about how we need to collaborate. The people and organizations in this room can be part of developing that national Aboriginal, or I should say Indigenous economic strategy for Canada. I think we need to do something like that. And there's so many elements that I heard of from each of the panelists that we can include as part of that strategy. So there's a lot of detail that they've given us. And I've taken a lot of notes that, you know, things that we need to talk about. But collaboration is the most important part of it. And I haven't seen our groups collaborate as much as we can nationally. And I think there's a lot of room to do that. And I think this might be the start of that kind of work. You know, a year and a half ago, I mentioned that I went to Australia, and I was so impressed there because my trip was just following the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action report. And I kept thinking, what do I see in there that I can do? And I think that that's something each of us should look at ourselves individually. What can we do? And when I looked at that, and then I went to Australia, and I thought, oh yeah, that's what we could do. We could start better engaging corporate Canada. And I really like what JP's doing in terms of PAR. And I think we could go even a little bit further. And to be quite honest with you, I've been so inspired by what they're doing in Australia. And I know that you feel that you're not as far ahead, Karen, but you definitely are in that regard, because I think there's real action plans there. As a matter of fact, I was thinking, like I said before, what can I do? I'm on a local health authority for Northeast Ontario, and I convinced our entity there that looks after all the hospitals and the long-term care homes and all of the clinics, every health service in Northeast Ontario, and this board authority looks at it, and I got them to do a reconciliation action plan. And in that plan now, every hospital board, every nursing home care board, everybody in the whole health system in that part of Ontario is being trained on what the impact of colonialism has done to Indigenous people. They're being trained about the beauty of the culture of our people. They're being trained on all of these things and what they can do, and they're all being asked to develop their own reconciliation action plans so that they can better serve this huge client group, because that's going to change the mindset when you have people taking that training, but also they're doing things like now, one of the things I mentioned in a report when I came back from Australia was things like where Australia Post has a sign at the entrance of every post office in the country that says, "Welcome, you're on the traditional territories of whatever." And I thought, isn't that a great thing? You know, so they're teaching people, every entity, whether it's Natural Resources Canada, you can have a reconciliation action plan. Whether it's a consultant group, you can have a reconciliation action plan. Everybody in this room, the government, each department should have their own reconciliation action plan. Each province and their departments should have a reconciliation action plan. That's how you start economic reconciliation. You have to have that plan. We talked about this national strategy, but in each of your areas of work, in each of the levels of government, we can all do the reconciliation action plans and engage the local Indigenous people in developing those plans and coming up with ideas. There could be simple things that are done, like that sign in the Australia Post offices. I think that's simple things to start making a difference. I know our health authority has everything in the language now, in our local languages, in the Mushkegowuk Cree and the Ojibwe languages in our Northeast Ontario. Every sign, everything. So they're doing so many good things. You can go on the website there and find their reconciliation action plan, but we can all do it. You can find reconciliation action plans on Reconciliation Australia's website. Some of the mining companies that they have are mining companies that locate here. So you can work with those mining companies, those health authorities, those education institutions to develop those kinds of plans too. This is all taking what we've learned from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, where we thought our people were just, some people thought of us as people who were prone to alcoholism and just despair and problem, an Indian problem, we were called. But when you learn what the root of all those issues are through reconciliation, it makes a big difference in people's mindsets and thinking. So I think that's going to be an important part going forward. And when I look at those plans, I think of Dr. Wilton Littlechild, about reconciliation. That's what those action plans are all about. So we got to take that forward and take that new terminology that we've learned today forward. So going forward, I'm so excited. We mined a lot of material today, and I want to take a moment to thank the Secretariat for the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board for the work that you did in pulling this together in a short time frame. I want to thank our partner at NACCA for helping us out with this. They did a lot of work. Really proud of the work that the path they're embarking on. I want to thank the Public Policy Forum for their great help in organizing this event too, because it really takes that kind of experience to help us go through all of this. I want to thank the elder who made it through all that rough weather to be here today, Elder Commanda, and thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to again acknowledge the people, the land, and the ancestors of Kittikinzibi and the Algonquin people here whose territories we were able to enjoy this day and come together in this great forum. So with that, I just want to thank you all again and assure you that our board will be putting together a report that will be shared. If you check our website, we share all of our reports there, and I hope it helps to motivate you to take things forward in a good way and help be the engine that moves economic reconciliation forward. Miigwech.